I'm Vincent DeLuise. I'm the cultural ambassador of the Waterbury Symphony Orchestra. We are living through an incredibly difficult time with the coronavirus crisis. It has affected all of us immensely. Our families, our friends, our communities, our country, the world. And yet there's something that's always been there for us. The humanities. The arts and music have been there to help us, to nourish us, to support us. Music and the arts have the power to heal. I would like to speak to you for a moment about music, especially the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Your brain on Bach, Bach's effect on us, and why we need him now. Music surrounds us. It's part of what makes us human. 40,000 years ago, humans were playing bone flutes. And probably well before that, humans figured out how music would affect their lives, influence their lives, and help make their lives better. The ancient Greeks talked about the 9 muses, the daughters of Mnemosyne and Zeus. The muse of music was Euterpe, whose name means the giver of much delight. Music gives us much delight. William Congreve, in his play The Morning Bride, talked about music having charms to soothe a savage breast, to soften rocks or bend a knotted oak. I have read that things inanimate have moved, and as with living souls, have been informed by magic numbers and persuasive sound. What is that persuasive sound, and why is it so important? And why does it go inside us and make us happier? This is the concept of music and the brain. And for the last few decades, there's been a tremendous amount of research on why music is so important to us. Here you see 6 of dozens of books on the topic of music, brain, and mind. You might notice the book on the lower right, the one that's entitled The Mozart Effect. You probably heard about the Mozart effect and why it might or might not be true and why it might actually be something worth looking into. And from the Mozart effect, we'll talk a little bit about Johann Sebastian Bach's music and why his music as well is important for our lives. What is the Mozart effect? The Mozart effect began when people started looking in the last part of the last century at brain architecture in the 1970s and 80s, and they noticed how organized and spatially temporal brain architecture was. And what they also noticed was that music is highly organized and spatial temporal, and that music and the brain share similar firing patterns. Neurons in the brain and music's linear progression from beginning and middle to end have a lot of similarities. In 1993, Frances Rauscher and her colleagues at the University of California, Irvine, did a study looking at whether or not music had some kind of effect on spatial cognition. They took 36 undergraduate students at the University of California, Irvine, and they asked them to do a Stanford Binet paper folding cutting test, preceded by 10 minutes either of Mozart's music, specifically his 2 piano sonata in D major, and then do that test. That same group was then given silence for 10 minutes and then asked to do the test. And then the same group was given 10 minutes of relaxation music and asked to do that very same paper folding test. And they found that after 10 minutes of Mozart's music, the same group, that group, I should say, did very well, or did better, at least for a few minutes, on the spatial temporal relationship task of paper folding and cutting. Why would that be? Or does that have any difference or any importance? Well, many studies have been done since 1993. Many of those studies have shown no effect by Mozart's music or anybody's music. Other studies actually have shown that there is some effect, perhaps small in time in terms of how long it lasts, but there's certainly an effect. But that might have been the end of the story, but it wasn't the end of the story. In the early 2000s, a group of neurologists at the University of Illinois looked at music and whether music had any effect on a neurological condition, specifically epilepsy. Could music help reduce epileptiform activity? So they chose music from dozens of composers, 58 composers, and they looked at the several compositions from each of these composers and whether or not it had any effect on epilepsy activity. And what they found was that the music of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and the music of the two Bachs, Johann Christian Bach and his father, the famous Johann Sebastian Bach, their music seemed to have the most effect. Whereas the music of other composers as famous as Stravinsky and Brahms and Richard Wagner and Chopin and Franz Liszt, dozens of other composers, had much less of an effect. They thought that the reason for this was that there was a high periodicity, a high repetitiveness in both the music of Mozart and the two Bachs that mimicked some of the periodicity in certain brain waves in our brain. So there certainly seemed to have been a Mozart effect, and in this study, of course, a Bach effect. So we can talk about there being a Bach effect. Indeed, the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, which is universally well known, is perfect for our brains. But why should music be perfect for our brains? What does music do in our brains? Where does it go? Well, it goes to a lot of places. There's a lot of big words on this slide: auditory cortex, which is the hearing part of our brain, and the temporal cortex on each side. There it is on the left. We're looking at the left side of a brain here. It goes to the orbital frontal cortex, which is the frontal lobe, which is where we make our decisions, our executive decision making. And it also goes to a lot of structures that are deeper in the brain here. Here you have the anterior cingulate, and we only can see it by cutting the brain vertically down the middle and looking inside. And several areas in what we call the midbrain, the nucleus accumbens and the ventral striatum and the amygdala. These loci, these brain loci, brain locations, some of them, many of them are activated by music, as well as, interestingly enough, dark chocolate and sexual arousal and certain drugs that are addictive, like cocaine and the opioids. And it affects similarly these areas, as well as inhibiting the inhibitory location of the brain, which is in the amygdala. So we have music and pleasure. And so why would that be? Why does music affect the same areas that are important for our lives? We wouldn't be here without certain things like sexual arousal. We wouldn't be alive. So what does music have that's so important? Why should music be so important as these other things? Why? Why is that? Well, we don't know why, but we know that it's true. And in that truth, we also know that the brains of musicians are different than the brains of non-musicians, that there's divergent thinking and creative thinking and thinking outside of the box and thinking outside of the building, for that matter, with musicians. Musicians use both sides of their brain for everything that they do. But you and I also use our brains, both sides of our brains, in listening to music. Music is going in both sides, and actually music is then organized in different parts of our brains differently. Timbre and melody go to one side and rhythm to another side. So that leads me back to the fact that we do need music, and we certainly need music now. And we certainly need, and especially need, the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, whose music uplifts us and moves us and soothes us. His Brandenburg concertos, his orchestral suites, his masses, his instrumental sonatas and cantatas, they're universally known and beloved. Bach's music heals. I want to leave you with a thought, which is that music gives a soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, and life to everything. We will now hear the Allemande movement from Bach's Sixth Cello Suite, performed by cellist Sophie Schau. Sophie is a friend of the Waterbury Symphony Orchestras who has appeared with the organization as a guest artist on more than one occasion. And in 2019, she served as the judge of its inaugural Thomas C. Clark Young Artist Concerto Competition. It's my pleasure to have you hear Sophie Schau in the Allemande movement of Johann Sebastian Bach's Sixth Cello Suite. Stay well and safe and always close to music. Thank you very much.